Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Speaker Series Winter Programme, our webinar about bigger picture issues aimed squarely at financial advisors. My name's Adam Saville, Intermediary Editor for Vitality, and we've got a very special session lined up for you today, not least because we are broadcasting at the very unusual time of 3 p.m, but because we're joined by a leader in their respective field, Professor Hal Hershfield, who's dialing in at the crack of dawn from the east coast of the US, California. But before I introduce you to Hal, I'd like to take this opportunity to give you a quick reminder of what else we've got lined up for the Speaker Series season. In February, we'll be joined by Gabby Logan, sports broadcaster and podcast host, to explore how to make workplaces more supportive for women in their midlife. Then, to close the winter programme, in March, we're joined by Dr. David Hamilton, who will dig into placebo and the healing power of the mind, and of course, what the insurance industry can learn from the preventative role of neuroscience. So some really fascinating stuff lined up. And don't forget, you can register for those on the Vitality Advisor website if you haven't done so already. So that brings us on to today's session. Now, all of us, I'm sure, are aware of the challenges we face when it comes to making better lifestyle decisions. And financial advisors are tasked with the difficult challenge of encouraging their clients to make better decisions, which often they don't want to make. Many of us think of life insurance as a grudge purchase, for example. And take our health and well-being. We live in a world surrounded by temptation, and it's far easier to make a bad decision today for instant gratification than it is to make one that's only going to benefit us later down the line. So today we're going to be discussing some of the behavioural science behind the decisions that we make as human beings, and how financial advisors can use this knowledge to help their clients. So it's my great honour to introduce you to Professor Hal Hershfield, behavioural science and psychologist from UCLA Business School. Hi Hal, thanks for joining us. How's it going?
Hey, good, Adam. Thanks so much for having me. I'm jealous that it's almost the end of your day there.
Yeah, well, actually I'm jealous it's the beginning of your day because you've got the sun rising, it seems, where the sun is very much going down on us today. So let's kick things off. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and the nature of your work.
Sure. So first off, thanks so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. So yes, I'm Hal Hershfield. I am a professor of marketing, behavioral decision making, and psychology at UCLA. And so just by way of background, I am a psychologist, a social psychologist, but I sit in a business school. What that means is I study decisions that matter in an applied context, like financial decisions and long-term health decisions, but I go at it from a psychological lens, really looking at sort of the underpinnings of why people do what they do and how we can try to help them do more of what they say that they want to do, if that makes sense.
So a lot of the work that you do focuses on the connection or lack of connection between our current self and our future self. And that's one that we're particularly fascinated by at Vitality. And I'm sure many of our financial advisors watching today will be interested to learn more about that. So in fact, let's start with perhaps why this disconnect exists from your expertise.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a great question. I'll take it back a step and just tell you, the sort of question of disconnect between who we are now and who we'll be in the future. It's not one that comes out of the blue or just from nowhere. So when I was first starting my graduate school work, I sat down with my mentor at the time and started talking about topics to study. And one of the things that she mentioned to me was psychologists aren't saying enough about retirement decision making, and I feel like we should have a seat at the table here. Why aren't people saving more? And I was like 24 at the time, and I thought it seemed like a really boring thing to to talk about, until I started looking into some of the literature on why it is that people have such a hard time thinking about the long term. And it really got me hooked on some philosophy literature. Actually, Derek Parfit, he's a British philosopher, and he's the one who, really popularized this notion that there can be a sense of disconnection between our current selves and our future selves. Now, why does this happen, and what does that mean? You know, I started reading that and thought, well, this is kind of a compelling idea, but is there any evidence that this is a real thing? And so, in my research, we decided to use some neuroimaging to look at what happens when people think about themselves in the distant future. And what we did, we put people in our MRI scanners, where you can scan people's brains as they make thoughts about different things. And we had them make judgments about themselves now and themselves in the future, another person now and another person in the future. And what we found is that when people think about their distant future self on a neural level, on a brain level, it looks a lot more like what happens when they think about another person. So even in the brain, our future selves seem like different people. They seem almost like strangers, if you will. So, so why does it happen? Part of the reason it happens is because it's really hard to think about the distant future. In some ways, we haven't really been set up to do this. When, only a few centuries ago, when life expectancy was a lot shorter than it is now, you didn't have to look ahead to the golden years of retirement. Maybe you looked ahead to 27 or 35 or whatever it was. And so now that people have these extra years on their lives, we have to actually plan for them, but it becomes increasingly difficult to do so because the people will be in the distant future feel on a neural level and on a psychological level, on an emotional level, they feel kind of like separations or separate people from who we are now.
So it's the way we always think of ourselves in the present moment and the relation we have with ourselves in the future. I'm interested in the idea of how we should treat ourselves in the way that we would sort of treat someone else that we cared for, right? And often, sometimes we don't do that. So I wonder, does this mean then that human beings don't really care about their future selves if they're willing to kind of make decisions that at the back of their mind they know are going to maybe harm them later down the line? So take kind of health and well-being from a point of view to sort of draw upon. So, but then you could argue at the same time, perhaps there's a thought that in the moment we're being kind to ourselves because we're doing that instant gratification that we really want at that moment. Have another donut or drink another soda or whatever, right? So what is it? What is our relationship with our current and our future self?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, it's smart that you brought up the idea of at the beginning of this question of how we think about other people, right? And so I think that's a really key factor to consider here, right? So let's start by thinking about how we actually treat other people, right? And if you were to talk to a hardcore economist, they would say we're self-interested people. We look out for ourselves. And to some extent that's true, right? Like if a stranger on the street stopped you, Adam, and said, "Hey, what are you doing this afternoon? Can you help me move my my flat to another location within London?" You'd say like, "No, I've got a lot of other things to do," right? And so would I say you're self-interested? Maybe you're focused on you, and it makes total sense. Well, think about what that means if our future selves are strangers. If our future self is thought of as another person and a stranger, well, when I'm then faced with a temptation, eat another donut, have like the big T-bone steak, or spend more money on the nicer car, the nicer TV, whatever it is. All of these decisions, in other words, that allow me to have some pleasure right now, but may make things difficult for later. Well, when you boil it down, all of those decisions might suggest, if my future self is another person and a stranger, who cares what's going to happen to that guy? That's not me. Why not eat the steak, eat the donut? How about a second donut? Who cares?
What if I was to or challenge that and say, well, what about our children? For example, when we are, we wouldn't let our children stay up past their bedtime because we know they'll be tired in the morning. We wouldn't let them eat lots of sugar at that moment because we know, for various reasons that's not good for them. But we sometimes find it challenging to make those decisions ourselves. And we'll come on to what it means to financial advisors and how they talk to their clients later. But I think it's interesting to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. I was just going to say, unless the child puts up enough of a fight that you say, okay, fine, you can do it. But no, but
Make your life
you're
easier that way.
yeah, right, exactly. But your point is a great one, which is that, when it comes to other people, we recognize those trade-offs are important. But, you could even look at it another way, which is to say that in some ways, the analogy of our future self as a complete stranger doesn't totally work. And in some ways, the sort of thinking that we are self-interested people doesn't totally work, because if your kid stopped you on the street and said, can you help me move? Or if your best friend stopped you and said, hey, I need some money, you probably wouldn't be so self-interested. You would probably make a sacrifice for their well-being. And so I think, that you need to take that perspective that we sometimes do things for other people to make their lives easier. And if we think about that and we think of our future selves, yes, maybe as other people, but rather other people who we feel a sense of connection to, a sense of an emotional bond with, in the same way that we do with our kids, our best friends, our spouses. Then all of a sudden it starts to seem a little more feasible, a little more palatable to make sacrifices today for their benefit later, right? So it's not, in other words, that we don't care about our future selves at all. It's that, some of us, some of the times, may care more or less about them. And when we do care about them, that's probably when we'll, increase our retirement contributions, up our life insurance, whatever it may be that'll make their lives a little easier. If that kind of falls in line, yeah.
Yeah, I think I like how we've really sort of dived into this, almost into the deep end of this, and we've kind of having these kind of revelations about it's our relationship with ourselves that we connect with, right? But let's kind of take the lens and shift it over to, I guess, an obvious point to make was that these issues, this disconnect that we've highlighted, is very much similar, or is a barrier that financial advisors need to overcome. And we can use many examples in their world. You mentioned retirement already, or for a life insurance advisor, it's expecting their clients or encouraging their clients to take out a protection or life insurance policy as a grudge purchase for when they get ill, sick, or eventually die. These are not nice things to have to spend money on, right? So not an easy thing to plan for. And then the other side to that as well is where there's opportunity to encourage them to make better lifestyle choices, right, and health. So let's start with the role of the financial advisor here. What is this kind of an explanation? Can we use this knowledge and your work to understand that challenge a little bit better and actually create better outcomes for the likes of financial advisors?
Yeah, so I think it's a really smart question you're asking. So, I think let me take a step back and say, look, these lack of connections that people feel, or these relationships that people have with their future selves, are important for the decisions that they make. So, like, before we even talk about the role of the financial advisor, I think it's worth saying that a lot of the research that I've done and a lot of the research that my colleagues have done have borne out the idea that the type of relationship we have with our future self matters for things like our savings behavior, our eating behavior, our exercising, even the tendency for us to make ethical decisions, which is also about a trade-off between now and later. In other words, if we ask people, if we measure the relationships that they have with their future selves, what we find is that the more of a bond they have, the more of a sense of connection they have, the more likely they are to do these things that will benefit them in the future, save more, eat healthier, etc. So then you ask about the role of the financial advisor, and I think part of the key here is recognizing what are the barriers that people have when they're trying to make these decisions that the advisors are trying to motivate, right? So let me start for a second to say, like, you got a lot of barriers, and I know everybody on the call recognizes this. Like, I'm preaching to the choir if I say there's a lot of barriers, but I think it's worth looking at the psychology of them, right? Not the least of which is some sort of optimism bias, right? This idea that I might kind of care about my future self, but assume life will be great for him. I have a colleague, Tally Sherritt, who has this great quote where she says, she's an expert in optimism bias, and she says, uh, people recognize, well, pardon the expression, but she says people recognize that the shit will hit the fan. They just don't think it'll hit their fan, right? And so I think, some of this happens. We sort of think things are going to work out okay for ourselves. But if you play that perspective out with this current self, future self relationship, or even to take your analogy, the parent-child one, it would be weird for me to say, you know what, I just think everything will work out for my kid. They'll be fine later on, and not do anything about it. Of course, you still want to prop them up to have them have as many advantages as possible, right? And so the same may be true for our future selves. Now, another barrier is what psychologists call temporal discounting, or present bias. It's a fancy term for just everything that's happening right now feels a lot more important, feels a lot more emotionally weighty than the stuff that's going to happen to us in the future, or by the way, the stuff that's happened to us in the past. And there's another barrier too, which is straight up procrastination and inertia. You may have clients, of course, who recognize that they should do something, they want to do something, but procrastination is another error that involves the trade-offs between current and future selves. Because if I don't do something right now, who's got to do it? Me in the future. It's that guy's problem.
Autonomy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly right, because it's still me, and on some level. So, I think, when you ask the question of, is this part of the reason why there's a challenge for advisors to get people to make these purchases that we know will ultimately help them, and by the way, that they know will ultimately help them. It's not like you're trying to convince people of something that they don't know is important. I think you're absolutely right that part of the problem here is that many of these purchases, most of them in fact, involve making some sort of sacrifice today for a benefit that won't be realized until some later point in time. And that is such a hard trade-off to make. I remember at some point I saw some meme that said, why should I do anything for future generations? What have they ever done for us? And I think this, the same could be true for future selves. What should I do for that guy? What has he done for me?
It's not happening now, so why should it affect me, right? And
yeah, that's exactly right.
I guess the conversation here is about sort of principles and values as well, isn't it? It depends on what an individual values more. Do they value instant gratification more because it benefits them at that moment, or is that prudent sort of decision that actually would help them in the future?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's difficult because my guess is that a lot of people will recognize the value of prudence. But to get them to recognize it in concrete fashion, right now is where it becomes particularly problematic and particularly hard, especially, especially when you're grappling with inertia, just the way that people have sort of continued to live their lives up until this point, right?
And can we quickly just break down those three behavioural signs? So there's optimism bias, temporal discounting, and inertia. Were they the three that you would?
Yeah, that's right. I would, with inertia, I would put procrastination. I think those two things go together, right? And so we sort of keep doing the thing that we're doing, and then fail to take action to do the things that we need to do. No, and to be really clear, to stay high level, all of those things sort of play into these connections or lack of connections between our current self and our future self.
And I'll pause there just for a moment, and just to remind our viewers that they can definitely send their questions for Hal to answer. I'll have some time at the end to ask Professor Hal your questions. If you've got anything that maybe even your own examples or anecdotes or questions around how this might have actually impacted, or these kind of things you come across on a day-to-day basis when talking to clients. And so you're a psychologist, Hal. So what about, how do we overcome barriers from a psychological point of view? We talk about the psychology of sales, for example, and a lot of advisors don't like to consider themselves as salespeople, because ultimately they're
Right.
providing advice, right? And there is,
Right.
and I'm sure, at the risk of teaching grandmothers to suck eggs here, though, I'm sure that our viewers will have an enormous amount of kind of knowledge around this area, but let's hear it from a psychologist's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, right? So, for what it's worth, I start from the perspective that it's not a sales industry per se, but this is really more about looking at clients in holistic ways, right? I'm gonna, I'll definitely answer your question about sort of overcoming these barriers, but I think it's really worth pointing out up front that what I believe you all are doing in this industry is, yes, of course, it's helping clients with their sort of financial decisions, but I think the best advisors also see themselves as part of a much bigger picture. And I know you know that, but I've been teaching to and talking to advisors for over 10 years now. And one of the things I remember about 8 to 10 years ago was the fear of what's going to happen with robo advisors. And I think a lot of those fears haven't really been realized, in part because robo advisors to date haven't been able to fill that crucial role of looking more at the client holistically. And so, to start there, it's worth noting, what have psychologists said about overcoming some of these barriers, right? And let's answer that question by going back to the idea that our future self may seem like another person altogether, right? If that's the case, what sort of things do we do to encourage people to take care of others, right? If our future self is another, then what can I do to get you to take care of them? Well, it's useful to think about charities, right? What do charities do? If they want to get you to donate, they make their potential recipients more vivid. This is a well-known fact from charitable organizations for decades now, right? A picture of one kid on a brochure or an internet ad is going to inspire a lot more emotion and desire to help than a statistic. And the irony, of course, is the statistic could be about, you could read a paragraph about 10,000 kids who are in need, and that's not going to inspire as much donation behavior as one picture of a kid. And I'm sure, Adam, you can think of countless examples of this. There's ones over the ages, that we can think of, but most recently, I think of, the refugee crisis. In 2015, there was a picture of one little boy. It's a very sad picture of one little boy on a beach of Turkey, who died after his family's boat capsized. That stoked international concern. It changed policies more so than all of the op-eds and all the statistics of hundreds of thousands of deaths that had happened before that. One picture. And so you take that idea and I think you apply it here, right? So one of the things we know is, if we can make the future self more vivid, if we can make it sort of pop out in the same way that a picture of a charity recipient does, that can make people start to think about and relate to their future selves better. So, in my own research, we've literally done this with pictures. We've presented our research participants with age progressed pictures, or an age selfie, if you will. And we've done this in all sorts of contexts. We've done it in virtual reality. We've done it online. We've done it through, pop-up blasts from banks, pop-up notifications from banks. And what we found is that when people are sort of confronted with their aged selves in visual form, they're more likely to want to make contributions to their retirement accounts, and they actually do. But the point of this is not, show someone what they'll look like as a grandparent and all of a sudden life will be better. That's not the point. The point is that when we present them ways in which the future self is made more vivid, made more concrete, that brings the future self closer to who we are now. You can do that through aged images. You can do it through a letter writing exercise where you have people write a letter to their future selves, and then also a reply from their future selves, because that really forces the perspective taking to happen, right? You can do it even through just having more of a conversation about who that future self is.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I think in the financial advice arena, especially within the life insurance and the health insurance field, we use a lot of claims case studies to bring that to life, and they might not be, you know, a kind of a countenance of them seeing their future self, but they see someone that it's happened to them. And one of the main barriers that financial advisors will get around life insurance is, well, this kind of assumption, it won't happen to me. And it's about finding that connection with them to make them think about, actually, this is closer to home than they think. And we had, for example, in the UK, we had, many of our viewers will be aware of the 7 Families project, which actually provided 7 families that were given an income protection policy. And their stories have been used by financial advisors to really hit home the power of this sort of stuff, because it brings it to life. So is that emotional connection, I guess, is what you're driving for?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that is a perfect start. And I would go even further, which is to say, trying to make sure that clients can connect explicitly to some of the people that are in those stories there, because the danger, like we talked about, there's optimism bias. And I could see those things happening and say, yeah, I recognize that's a thing, but it's not a thing that's going to happen to me.
It sucks to be them, kind of thing, right? But it won't happen to me, right? That kind of.
Exactly. And then you lose the power of that, right? So I think that, the sort of enhanced version of this is yes, to present those sorts of stories, but then to try to prompt clients to think about how those sorts of things happening could also happen to them, and make that explicit. But because you started this sort of line of questioning by asking about overcoming these barriers, right? And so the one answer I gave is making that future self more vivid, right? But really trying to foster that form of connection, whether it's through vividness or something else, right? Writing a letter, whatever it may be, is part of the equation. The other part of the equation is making it easier to take the action right now, right? In other words, if you're going to present those stories, the 7 case studies, or if you're going to try to get people to see themselves in the future as the realistic version of themselves, who they are, you still need to grease the wheels and make it easy for them to make the sort of decisions that they're undertaking right now. A couple summers ago, there was this face aging craze that took over the world. It feels like a quaint time, pre-COVID 2019, and there was Face app, one of these apps, and all these celebrities, hundreds of millions of people actually did this, right? Age their face. And because of the research that I do, people were asking me, like, oh, are all sorts of people now saving more for retirement? Are they upping their health insurance, et cetera? And my answer was probably not. And I don't think that we've seen the data suggesting that. And the reason is that none of those exercises were connected to the ease of making a change. And so that always needs to be there. And I think, I know the best advisors know how to do this, or know that they need to make it easy. But psychologically, from an intervention standpoint, one of the best things I think we can do is what's called an implementation intention. And what that means is help people work on figuring out how they're going to implement their change. Literally, like I'm talking nuts and bolts logistics here. On Wednesday at 8 p.m., I'm going to sit down with my spouse, my partner, and go over my benefit options. I'm going to go over my insurance options, my retirement options, et cetera. That's when I'm going to sit down and do this thing. And then the next week, let's have another meeting and actually fill out the forms together, whatever it may be. By doing that, you're connecting the future self to an easier way of actually implementing the action today.
I love the idea of financial advisors becoming almost like a kind of not like a life coach, but like someone that, so for me personally, my financial advisor kind of helped me grow up. and I kind of really appreciate that. I got to a stage where I was like, oh, I should probably put some life insurance in place, or I should probably think about kind of making more adult decisions. And I didn't really know where to start with that. And I had somebody that I could rely on that could help me kind of treat. And it goes back to an earlier conversation. It was able for me to be kind to myself, right? To make a decision that I ultimately deserved to make for myself, because in the past I was just putting it off. And we'll come on to, I think, kind of value in a moment. I just want to also, again, remind our viewers, ask your questions if you've got anything you want, any comments or questions for Hal. We will have some time at the end. But is this a question of value as well? So we've talked about life insurance as something when we're asking clients to pay their premiums, but we're not necessarily giving them anything in return other than the thought, the peace of mind that in the future they'll get what they need at the time of crisis. So how important is kind of offering value now? I mean, insurance providers provide a lot of these days a lot of additional support for clients. So should advisors be using that to help encourage them to think they're getting something today and not just tomorrow?
Yeah, I think that's a really important insight there, right? Because I think if we frame all these decisions as you're doing something that's going to benefit you later, that may really fall on deaf ears. Because again, if I feel this sense of disconnect, well, yeah, okay, great, but there's a lot of things I'm grappling with right now. Even the most conscientious clients who are working really hard, they've still got a million things pulling at them right now. And so, you asked about sort of the value that you're creating there. And I think one way to frame this is simply to say, these products that we can offer, in other words, whatever the insurance product may be, whether it's in the health space, whether it's an annuity in the financial space, part of what they're doing is not just taking care of future you, but they're also alleviating, whatever potential underlying anxiety or worry present you may be experiencing about what the future will hold. And so, knowing that I've checked that box and taken care of whatever the product may be can alleviate some of that anxiety right now. Now you say, okay, well, what if that anxiety isn't there to begin with? Now, I'm not saying an advisor should create it or stoke it, but I do think that part of the value and part of where the conversation needs to go from advisors is to have an honest conversation about who that future self is and what version of that future self is going to benefit from or suffer as a result of the decisions that are being made right now. I'm happy to elaborate on that a little bit, but I think that being concrete about that can start to force clients today to recognize the need to take care of these sorts of things for later.
So what about rewards and incentives then? What about when it comes to, you mentioned interventions earlier, and with a kind of any sort of protection or health insurance proposition, for example, prevention of illness is always going to be good for everybody, right? It's good for the client because they don't get sick. It's going to be good for the insurer because they don't have to pay out that claim. And also it's good for the wider society because there's less illness and more productivity. So we're talking about that sort of the value exchange that you mentioned. So how about, how important can behavioral economics and behavioral science and some of the things in your world, how can they be implemented to encourage people to incentivize more positive lifestyle choices, for example?
Yeah, it's great. I think there's been so much research over the decades now about the value of these, various ways to motivate people, right? I think this is like fundamentally a question about motivation, right? And so, my dream would be that you do tie incentives to some of these behaviors, right? So in other words, it's not enough to just know that I've taken care of the future, but can I get rewarded for this? By the way, this is of course the basis for safe driver programs from car insurance programs. The safer I'm driving, the lower my premium is going to be. I know some health insurers have done these sorts of things as well. Like if I have more preventative visits to doctors, that may lower my premium as well. And so, one of the insights here, and this is, I fully recognize an more abstract idea that becomes more difficult to actually implement, but it's something that's worth thinking about, is that because there are these trade-offs between our current self and our future self. If there's some way to reward the current self right now for, say, enrolling in a retirement program, for enrolling in health insurance, whatever it may be, that may spread some of the wealth out. It may spread some of the rewards out. So I have this dream of, saving for retirement. Every milestone I hit, I get some like financial reward back, and I get to spend it today. Maybe that takes out of my overall pie, but my speculation is that would keep people involved longer. Same with health insurance. Like the more preventative visits I go to, the less I tax the overall system. Maybe I get some sort of reward there. Does that take away from the overall pot of insurance money? Maybe, but if it could do so in a way that, with rising tides, lifts all boats, then that could actually be also beneficial, right? So it's constantly a question of figuring out, how do you tie the incentives? How do you actually structurally put them into place? And I'm the first to admit this is a really difficult nut to crack, and it's really hard to do. But when you sort of play this out on an individual basis, on a one-on-one conversation between advisor and client, then I think you end up starting to think about the different ways that advisors can shift the conversation so that it's not just about like enrolling these products in the abstract, but rather talking about the ways that engaging in these sorts of products, enrolling them, et cetera, will also change sort of the values in the life that you're living now as well as later, sort of making sure that trade-off is made explicit there.
So you're enriching their life from day one, and actually giving them something that they can enjoy potentially, rather than something that a lot of financial advisors will rightly use the phrase, I'm going to put this policy in place, but I hope you never have to use it. I hope you never get seriously ill. Whereas I guess you could flip that and say, I'm going to put this policy in place, and I want you to use it every day. I want you to hit these goals. I want you to be motivated. I want you to benefit from these extra things, so that you don't even have to feel like you're losing out. I guess is the term loss aversion is one thing that kind of often people would be much prefer much prefer to gain something to lose something, right? Can you explain that? I'm explained that very well.
No. I think you got it. And the basic idea behind loss aversion, of course, is that just as you said, there's an asymmetry there between how bad a loss feels to us and how good a gain feels to us. And what the classic research from Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky suggests, that in fact losses loom larger than gains, and a loss of $5 feels subjectively worse than a gain of $5 feels good. The reason that I think this is relevant here is that when you talk about preventative behaviors, like insurance, part of what you're talking about there is the prevention of loss. And this, it's very difficult when you say, I hope you never have to use it, because I think that part of the subjective feeling on the client's part there is that I'm paying a lot of money not to use something. But if you flip it around, I think it can resonate a little bit more, which is that I'm paying so that I can continue to be safe. I'm paying so that I continue to have a cushion for me now and me later, right? It's not just me in the future, but it's literally me right now, because any of these bad events could happen in a minute. It's not that it has to happen in 20 years.
With an income protection policy, for example, you're putting in place your ability to live. It's kind of putting the life into death benefit, right? It's almost like, because if there was a reason for you not to be able to earn an income, that then how can you afford all the things that you do in life, your bills, and not even just your bills and rent and mortgage. It's just going out and buying a coffee. or
Right.
going out and going on a holiday or something, right? These are things we all take for granted, and it's encouraging a client to think about what would happen if they were to lose that or not be able to have that, I guess, is one of the key things, the switch that might need to be flipped in the client's mind potentially.
That's exactly right. And I mean, I think to add to that, of course, like know your client, right? If you're talking to somebody who's single, it's a different conversation than someone who is a partner and who has kids, because then, of course, many of these drawbacks befall your spouse and your kids, and you have to start thinking, and we all know this, you have to start thinking about what happens to them. But I do think that it's not enough to just say, what if something bad happened, but to just get concrete about it. And this is a lot of what I've been sort of trying to touch upon here about these, trade-offs between current and future selves. Concretely, what were to happen if you were to lose your income and your partner and your kids, or even your parents, or whoever it is that may have that, that may be on your dime, whoever that is, what would their life look like? Would they be able to pay for their rent or their mortgage, college tuition, et cetera? I think getting specific there and noting what would happen were you to lose your income can make it a little bit more real than just this question of like, what were to happen if, if you suddenly got hit by a bus. It's because nobody thinks about that I'll actually get hit by a bus. That just doesn't really resonate, I think.
I've heard of financial advisors actually take out a bank statement and highlight all of the things that they would not be able to do if their income was to stop. And then if you throw in the amount of sort of state benefit that they would receive from the government, which I think in this country is around about £90 a week, which is certainly isn't going to cover my rent in London, for example. So, yeah, I mean, I want to come on to the concept of Healthspan, but again, a reminder to our viewers, get your questions in. We're coming up to question time, and please do share your comments and ask your questions for Hal. But I know you worked recently with the Vitality Research Institute on some on the concept of Healthspan, and I think definitely relates to a lot of the things we've been talking about, the behavioural economics and the science behind. Right. How we can make decisions today to impact our future self. But I think, what about Healthspan? We're very much familiar, especially in the advice space, with the concept of life expectancy. You talked about retirement. Yes. Life expectancy is always going to impact how much we need to save, and also kind of when we retire, and how many good years and how many years we will live into retirement. So, what about Healthspan, and why should a financial advisor care about that?
Right. So first it's important to say, like, what is Healthspan? And I think it's a really smart concept because it's not looking at lifespan or life expectancy, so as once you get out of childhood and you've survived to age 10, then, you can expect to live to whatever it may be in your country for your group. So it's 78, 85, whatever it is. Well, lifespan there is different than Healthspan. Healthspan is how many healthy years do you have left to live? Now, I think there's a movement among gerontologists to say, let's not try necessarily to expand lifespan, but rather what they say is to compress morbidity. What that means is you don't want to have that long tail of decline so that you hit 60 and then you suddenly have 25 years of failing health, right? What you'd rather have is, let's have someone live to 85, but have a very sharp drop off at the end so that you're basically healthy until the very end. That seems a lot better than trying to expand people's lives to 120 when the last 20 to 30 years are you're frail and enfeebled, right? So, so this concept of Healthspan is really important here because as you get people to think about future selves, one of the errors that arises is that people think of a specific type of possibly undesirable future self, which is that sort of aged, older, decrepit version, which may not be that accurate of a reflection of reality. So there's a bias, an aging bias, where people think that old age is characterized by health complaints, negative emotions, all these things. The research, by the way, paints a very different picture. So work that I've been involved in over the years suggests that older people actually experience more positive emotions and fewer negative emotions than their younger counterparts. And that's largely because they've pruned their social networks and they've pruned their activities so that they focus on the meaningful ones. If you know that you have a limited amount of time left, you're not going to spend it doing stuff that's not that important, nor will you spend it with people who are not that important. So I bring this up to say, let's tie this back to this idea of health span, which is to say, let's try to maximize the number of healthy years that we have between now and the end of life. And when you think about doing that, when you think about taking actions today that promote healthy years, when you think about incentivizing people to act in ways that actually lead to healthier years later on, what that then does, I think it shifts the conversation away from protecting yourself when you're old and having money and health insurance there to provide a cushion for when something goes wrong. It shifts the conversation to a promotion one, which is how can we promote you to take action today so that you can live in a healthy way, in an active way, to whether that means traveling, whether that means spending more time with your kids or grandkids, whether it means not doing those things, but healthily focusing on whatever hobby is that you have now or might have in the future. I don't want to be cliche and say, oh, everybody wants to travel, everybody wants to spend time with their grandkids. It could be something different. But the important point is that the health span conversation moves that interaction, that conversation away from preventing negative things to promoting positive things, many of which we're starting to see older generations do more and more of now.
Yeah, yeah, and providing potentially seeing insurance propositions evolve in a way that gives them the tools that they need in order to make those better decisions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so I think, right now the research that I'm been involved in with Vitality, part of the question that we've been looking at. So this is a research project I've been doing with some colleagues at UCLA, Porras Kambata and Milena de la Fuente. One of the things that we've been doing is starting with the question of what is it that people want to know about their futures? This is a really abstract question, but it becomes important. And we started with this question. It turns out a lot of people have this question of how long will I live? Will I be healthy? Will I be happy? Yes, if you ask the question, a lot of people, somebody says, what will the lottery numbers be on April 14th, 2024? Well, we can't predict that. But a lot of the things that people want to know about the future that they only could have asked in science fiction novels 30 years ago, now we can start to give them some forecasts about. I can give you a forecast about your health span. I can give you a forecast even about your lifespan. Of course, it's not perfect, right? It's a forecast, just in the same way that the weather is a forecast. It could rain, it might not, but I can give you a good sense of what might happen were you to continue living your life the way that you're living, or were the clouds going to have the pattern that they continue to have. But what we're hypothesizing right now is that it may not be enough to give you a forecast about your health span, but rather to also give you some concrete steps about how you can increase that health span. And I use the word steps there, almost in a unintended way there, but to say, if I were to tell you, Adam, you could add 2 more years to your health span if you walked 20 more minutes a day. Well, my bet, and our bet right now, is that that's a pretty easy action to implement. You could switch your daily routine a little bit, and that might help. And the research is bearing out that these are the types of things that we could do that could maximize health span. So the bottom line here is that it may not be enough to just tell people do some more positive things today to increase your health span so that life is better in the future. But let's give people some very actionable steps that they can implement, and that's key.
Would you agree that now is the time to do it? We're going through a pandemic at the moment. We're more aware of our health and well-being, arguably, than ever before. The term at risk has been one that, especially throughout the pandemic, we're more aware of our risk of a respiratory illness and the impact of perhaps being of obesity or having a kind of a condition and being vulnerable to physical illness. So this stuff's front of mind for many clients at the moment. You know, being aware of our own health and well-being. So it's now the time to bring about kind of how we can take preventative steps to borrow your term there, to improve our health and well-being.
I would say yes, but with a caveat, which is that now is always really hard. Literally now is hard because I know I've got a lot of things. This week's busy, next week's busy. So like now in the general sense, yes, but I would actually say, you know, when's a good time to do this? How about you wait till February? You know, how about you wait till like right after Valentine's Day or whatever it is? You know, we know from research by Katie Milkman and Heng Chen Dai, my colleague at UCLA, that fresh starts are really motivational for taking action. I'm more likely to go to the gym on a Monday than I am on a Friday. I'm more likely, of course, you know this, I'm more likely to go to the gym in January than, you know, at the end of December.
I was going to say, I wonder how many New Year's resolutions have already been broken. I'm sure, you know, we're now
what is it, January 26th? Yeah, probably a lot already, right? We've passed that 2 week mark. The point though is that it may not be enough to just say let's do it right now, but like if you can actually give people the option to take some action but do it in a couple weeks or in a month, that may be the type of thing that allows them to commit and then take action a little later, you know, when their calendar is cleared up, especially if they've sort of psychologically blocked off that they are going to do it then.
And one of the questions that's come in actually is what's the one behavior change that we can make in order to provide the most benefit to our health span?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, what we're, you know, what we are trying to implement together with the team at Vitality is to encourage more walking. Sorry, I'm going to give the professor answer here of it depends, because the problem is
personalization.
Yeah, and so I'm sorry, I hate to sort of, you know, to do that, but I think one of the things that behavioral economics 2.0 or 3.0 at this point is recognizing is that one size fits all solutions are not the way to go about things, because there's heterogeneity out there. There's different segments of the population. I mean, you know, we know that, you know, this from sales and you know this from marketing, but it's something that behavioral economics is paying particular attention to. So while I want to say, you know, overall, the one thing we can do is to get more cardio and walk more, I would say it depends on the individual person. And this is part of what we are actually doing in a more sophisticated way is, you know, using algorithms to say what is the type of thing that somebody could do to change their health span, and then encourage them to do it. You know, so for you, Adam, it may be eating less red meat. I have no idea if that's really what it is. For me, it could be, you know, getting up and walking more. For somebody else, you know, the obvious one could be stop, you know, quitting smoking, which is obviously a much harder thing to do than to walk more. So while I would love to say to you, you know, the one thing is this thing, I think it really depends on the individual client.
And rewarding them for the outcome as well. And from an insurer's point of view, maybe the actuarial benefit of somebody giving up smoking, for example, would allow them to lower their premiums. So therefore, there's a kind of an opportunity there to almost give that value back as an incentive and reward.
I think that's right, and I'll just add one more thing there, which is to say, if you know, if you're serious about that, then the provider should also provide easy options to, you know, to cut out the behavior, right? So, you know, whether that's benefit, you know, whether you're, you know, helping to contribute to or providing access to smoking cessation programs, whatever it may be, anytime we try to encourage behavior, but we don't give that easy route to take care of it, then it becomes up to the client. And
the tools I mentioned earlier is kind of access to tools and giving them the triggers that they need. I've got a couple of questions have come in. One of them is around sort of disclosure. Actually, it's quite an interesting one. I'm always wary on each insurance piece I do that the client forgets to provide critical information which may stop a claim in the future. The question goes on to say, how relaxed can insurers be around this if it was to occur? But I guess what Jonathan Dennings is asking is kind of how can we get disclosure right? You know, like when getting clients to disclose something they might not want to disclose because they might think that it's going to harm them and their insurance application, with maybe even a decline or increased rating of premium. But actually, by not disclosing it, that will remove the chances of a claim completely, potentially later down the line. So I guess there's a psychology here to getting disclosure right.
Yeah. Hey, Jonathan. I actually think this is a really interesting question because there's, you're playing on one thing, which is encouraging honesty, but you're playing on this other thing, which is this like these trade-offs about like just Adam, the way that you put it, is quite smart. And so I would actually think that there's two solutions here. One is to make the questions themselves easy to answer because sometimes um like sometimes you ask somebody, for example, how much income did you make last year? I might not know that answer necessarily because I don't know what my take home was. But if I change that question, and this is something I'm working on with a professor at Wharton, Wendy De La Rosa, and say to them, what was your paycheck last week? Well, but now the question's a little different and I might get a more accurate answer. I'm just raising this as an example, right? And so are there health questions? Are there risk questions that I could ask that will elicit better answers? Do you smoke? Yes or no? Is more abstract. How many cigarettes did you have last week? Is more concrete. And it's hard for me to say no to that if I might think of myself not as a smoker, but if I had 2 social cigarettes last week, that's a different answer. So I think that's one solution, is to change the questions. The other solution, and you hinted at it, is to make it transparent, make it explicit, not in legal terms. In other words, not if you falsify these answers, that may invalidate your claim, but rather explaining in plain English what would happen if you're to not be totally truthful here. And it's more about a question of not a battle between the insurer and the client, rather, or a battle between the advisor and a client, but let's work together to make sure that this policy is going to be, fully realized if needed. And that's only going to happen if you give us answers that we can
I
work
love that. I love that. It's kind of, let's have an adult conversation about
with.
this.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think there's another point about preventative action as well. It's like by saying to the client, this provider does not want to pay out a claim. Let's be honest about this, right? They don't want to because it's going to cost them loads and loads of money. So actually, if you keep yourself healthy, they'll reward you because that's in their
yeah,
interest. And the individual might go, oh yeah, that makes absolute sense.
yes.
Obviously, they will pay the claim if needed, but I'll pay higher premium depending on my smoker status, for example, right? Because we've got to be honest and upfront and like you've said. Time for one more question. We've just got a few minutes left. How much more effective is asking a customer to imagine themselves in a situation themselves rather than telling or creating a situation for them?
Yeah, and I think this really harkens back to the conversation we were having that you brought up about the 7 case studies or the 7 families, I think you
Yeah,
said.
that's it.
And I will caution to say, to be fair, to the best of my knowledge, the empirical research hasn't been done here to say like, let's compare situation X versus situation Y. I would speculate though that it's going to be more effective to ask clients to imagine themselves in a given situation than to tell them, or to create some situation for them. For one single reason, which is that there's so much nuance to our everyday lives and our everyday situations and our family setup and our partner setup and whatnot, that if I tell you to think about this particular client, I might have missed enough sort of key nuanced details that it makes it that much more difficult for you to actually picture that set of circumstances happening to you. And so I
Mm.
think, instead, you can come up with a script. You can come up with a script of, let's think about what sort of thing might take you out of the workforce, and that sort of question alone is going to prompt different things. Like for me, I'm not going to think about the classic getting hit by the bus, but I'm thinking about, I've thrown out my back before. And, what if I were to do that really bad and I can't teach and I can't give, and my income dries up because of that? Well, that's more easy for me to imagine actually happening. And then I start playing out, well, what would that actually mean on a concrete basis for my family? Well, now that's nuanced, that's individualized, that's specific to me. And it may be a little easier to imagine. So I would rather start with a general question and have
Mm.
clients think about, playing that out for them and then sort of carrying the conversation forward. And that to me is just another hallmark of a good advisor, knowing how to introduce that conversation to then create a smoother glide path between present selves and future selves.
Brilliant. That's a fantastic place to end, Hal. And thanks to Peter Farrar for that question there. It's an excellent question.
Thanks, Peter.
Brilliant. Thank you for joining us, Professor Hal. I hope the viewers have enjoyed it as much as I have. Yeah, if you've sent any questions, we haven't had time to ask them, apologies, but there's always an opportunity to kind of continue the conversation offline, I'm sure. But thanks for everyone for tuning in. We've run out of time. See you next time on the speaker series, where we're joined by Gabby Logan on the 26th of February. So once again, thanks Professor Hal for joining us. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
Thanks, Adam.